Yeah, for sure. So, did you want to talk about drawing or painting or both, or what exactly were you hoping to have covered today? Okay, that's what I thought because you had said that yesterday. Yeah, so and just to give me, I guess, like a little bit of just help of what to talk about, because again, I've looked at your work and I have like that's the context I have kind of where you're at. So, what do you feel is like the most useful to focus on? Just like how to render, like color, things that you would like to have attention called to would be kind of interesting to hear just what your perspective is on that. Yeah. 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 Well, that's definitely what it is. So we'll definitely talk about that. So I'm on your page that you previously sent. Um, okay. Yeah, because this like this one is sort of like in a like atelier sort of practice feel to it. Um, and then I'm not sure what this other image is here for me. That's is that old? Okay. Okay. So this is just like I see. This is an environment example of this. Okay. Gotcha. Yeah. Yeah. Usually that's not, people's intentions. So I totally get that. Yeah, we can talk about that too. So yeah, I'll download that and just like drop that in here. And then just going back, so I'm flipping through like the work on your I guess portfolio website that you have. And it generally seems like you have this kind of flatter style. And I don't know if is that like what you want to go for, or is that just you would like to paint a more like rendered style, but you just are avoiding that? Okay, sure. Yeah, and I mean honestly, that's the wiser thing to do is like it's better to show stronger art that's like less whatever, less rendered, quote unquote. I mean, there's so many that can mean so many things, but than having something that's unfinished feeling. Okay, okay, yeah, okay. So let me go ahead and share, and I'll share. Yeah, just do the whole desktop. Uh, okay, and is that everything showing up for you? Okay, so we can just really quick go over this. So a very common issue, right, is it's muddy feeling. So if we go to just grayscale and squint at it, what happens is like distinctions between important parts of the planes of the shapes get lost, so the value change isn't big enough, and that's what causes that muddy feeling. Because usually like what does muddy even mean, so like defining what we mean when we say that, and I think what most people are reacting to is it's the loss of form. It's not the colors necessarily. Like there is another issue potentially with color that we also call muddy, but it will that can look okay if the values are good because you still can see the shapes that the thing is made out of at a glance. But if something is too slow to understand because it's confusing, then that causes like that will cause frustration. So that's what's happening here is it's just there's too many important pieces that get lost. So like we can't see this railing against the background, and we can't see the plane changes like between like that and that where it's like a 90-degree change. So the value doesn't change, but the planes do. So it's like an optical illusion where you need the values to reinforce what you're trying to simulate. Because all of it's a trick, right? So if any part of it starts to not work, it becomes a problem. And then some just this is a very complicated image, right? So you have a lot of overlapping pieces. So like this here, I should, you know, make this actually just put a grayscale over this. So this whole area, the values don't change enough. So again, it connects things together that should be overlapped. So all of the shapes just getting connected, and it's like it's more like kind of a bunch of little problems. There isn't like one big problem. It isn't like it's this bad image or something, right? It just needs to have more contrast between those plane changes, and it's kind of tedious to do that, but it will all of a sudden magically feel way better if you go through and make those changes. And these shapes too, like this might, I mean, it sounds like nitpicky to say it, but it's definitely like this does make the difference. So for instance, inside here in these two values are the same, and then they're separated by this light value. And that's a mistake because it's treating it like a line to try and outline it instead of saying the actual overall shape is a different value. It's actually the same value next to each other, and then there's just a brighter value in between. And it's almost like using a drawing trick
Hmm.
inside of a painting. And if you go rendering something with painting, you can't use drawing tools anymore to like separate out pieces, right? Whereas like in a drawing, everything is lines. In a painting, everything has to be value changes. It can't mix in this like lines, and that's effectively what this is a line. So it's sort of like this again, sending like mixed ideas across, so it becomes kind of frustrating to look at. And again, just overlapping, like you have these cool shapes, like there's all these like neat shapes stacked up on top of each other, but from a design standpoint, it's probably also like too much like packed together in a space, and it doesn't have very good silhouette, so it's already a little bit confusing, and then the values make it very confusing. So I would push these shapes out so they break the silhouette more, and you get like more like recognition off of the shape like quickly, because it takes too long to look at this and understand what's going on. And like you have the shapes kind of encapsulated inside of these other shapes. So like the edge of this dish here is touching the tangenting the edge of the roof. So there's just some sort of like confusing groupings of shapes. So you have minimal outside silhouette, because outside silhouette's the strongest, right? That's why when we design, oftentimes you see people make a silhouette, is because we understand that the number one thing when you glance at something and you look at it, and that's why I have this little window down here. I have the navigator open so I can see like the silhouette at a small size always. And if I'm not seeing detail along the outside of here, for instance, where you have all these kind of important details on this building, none of them break the overall shape of the building. So it makes it more difficult to look at. And then that plus the values not being different enough is creating confusion. And it's there isn't like this exact science to it, but it basically comes down to what makes something not frustrating. I would say just comes down to how quickly you can identify what's happening in the image. And what is that amount? I don't know, right? It's not like I can say, oh, it needs to be 1.3 seconds and therefore it's good, right? But what's happening is you have to look too long to kind of like figure out what's going on, and that's it's not meeting that clarity threshold. And that can be a difficult answer to the question, because that's undefined, right? Like what is that clarity threshold? But it doesn't really matter exactly. Like you have to figure that out with each image because they're all different. What you need to know is that's what's happening. So if you say this is just not feeling right, 99% of the time, that's really the core issue of what's going on. And if you correct that, which is tricky to do, but if you are able to correct that and get the readability of it quicker, you won't be frustrated by it anymore. And then it becomes a lot more encouraging because the things that are left to fix are all kind of minor by comparison to that issue. And it's more fun to work on something when you can see the finish line of, oh, okay, this is looking good. And then I just tweak these things and it'll feel totally finished. So that's what's going on. And that's almost always what's going on. When images feel that way. And then from a presentation standpoint, and I don't know, maybe this isn't the final presentation, so maybe this is just a bad call, but I would definitely like make this just be larger on your page too, because it's just like it's so complicated. So then you have all this empty space around it, so it makes it feel really small. That's an easy thing to fix. Um, so that's kind of the quick version of it.
I see.
So hopefully there isn't an easy answer. So it's like, and in terms of this image, like how would I even approach going about making those changes? Um, Probably what I would do is I would cut out different pieces. So I'd like take the marquee and every piece that I want to change, like I'd pull it out if it needed to break that silhouette and repaint the parts behind it. And then I would mask off all of the parts that are important plane changes or just like overlaps. So I'll just like do a fast version of this. So it's like, yeah, it'd be pretty tedious, but there's no way around it if you don't have it on another layer. But like cut out all those in between those two. Um, and then just uh, adjust the values on this and look at it in grayscale when I'm adjusting those values until when I look down here, there's clarity. And also just look for any sort of problem areas. So this is a problem area, for instance, because when we have overlaps are good, right? We don't want things to just end next to other things. If it's behind, if you have something behind something, having it overlap is generally the desirable thing because it helps enforce there's depth. But we don't want tangents because that creates confusion where things that exist on two different planes feel like they might continue into each other. So that's a problem. So that's also creating confusion. So this is causing issues on that end. So I would probably just move this out of the way in this case, because I don't think having that overlap, it's
Oh,
probably kind of difficult. So I would just like move this entirely. And also it's like it's lining up with this here. So there's a tangent there with the
mm,
top of the railing. So go look for all your tangents and any sort of continued line. So like here, I'll just go through it and like just see the ones that, as I look and just see, okay, where are problems, right? So there, that is one. This and this are close to each other. So it's like a parallel lines that are tangents next to each other. I'll zoom in a little more. Um,
I see.
it, clarity where one thing stops and another thing begins. So here it's confusing there because I can't we this is tangenting that post behind it. So it's taking two things that exist at different depths and it like combines them together.
Mm,
And it's those MC Escher drawings with like the stairs that connect in a cube that doesn't make sense, but it makes sense on a flat. But then as soon as you think about it in 3D, it doesn't make sense. That's like kind of little versions of that are what tangents tend to cause to happen. And that's, we don't want that, right? We're not trying to create an optical illusion, but it's like an accidental optical illusion. Um, there's a tangent there. This and this line up. The ladder has tangents because like the rungs are tangent with that, so it's a little unclear, like this
mm.
is tangenting there, like the edge of the door, it disappears behind that entirely because there's a tangent with that line. So giving a little more space so things don't have tangents and just like clarity of like how the pieces are organized. And again, this is a very tricky image because there's a lot of pieces to it, but that will help a lot because again, all of it just comes back to like clarity, right? And it's like if we don't have visual clarity, it's really difficult to overcome that using any other tools at our disposal, right? We can keep painting it and add all sorts of effects and stuff, but if we don't have this, we're always fighting against that problem. So it's best to just like deal with this first, and it
Right.
will make all those other things so much easier.
True. I see. Well, that really helps a lot because actually in the winter break, because it's finished from the last semester, right? And throughout the winter break, which is like I really don't satisfy with what I have
Hmm.
as this piece, and I don't know where's the problem. And
Yeah.
I was almost going to rejoin, but I don't think that's gonna fix the problem. But like until
Yeah.
until like explained to me, I just like, oh yeah, that's like something I never like really pay attention to, because like I was building a 3D model on Blender and Maya of
Yeah.
this one, and I was just like, yeah, let's just like trace over it and like everything will be fine because like it was designed with like shape
Yeah.
linkage and everything. But
Yeah.
yeah, that's really like something new I realized. So yeah.
Yeah, I think what happens is so when you're earlier on in
Mhm.
learning something, it's easier to see what you're doing wrong. And there's like, oh, obviously I'm just like not good at this. So it's like easy to fix. But then when you start to get better, the problems you have become more nuanced or more abstract. So they're harder to identify. So again, there's nothing like egregiously wrong with the image, but it has a bunch of little things that add up to being a problem. And
Mhm.
those are the harder ones to kind of perceive of or get in the habit of checking. But you just really need to like develop this habit of like this checklist of just like, okay, these are the types of things I know will cause problems. And you just can analyze it becomes kind of just a generic way to evaluate work, and it's a skill that you can develop. And it's like, just when you look at any artwork, just kind of look for those things and look for how people avoided them too. So say, oh, there could be a tangent there and they didn't do it, right? It's like a lot of good artists, when you look at like their appealing artwork, and you're like, oh, that looks really nice. Part of why is because there are very conscious decisions of how shapes interact with each other and maintain clarity, as well as things like interesting angles and contrast, like all of the stuff that makes something good. We're not just trying to make stuff not bad, we're trying to also make it actually good, right? So it's like, but how they can overcome the potential issues that can happen. And there are also just bigger questions to ask when you start an image. So for instance, this is kind of a tricky image just anyway, because it's very the angle is a little bit tricky because of like seeing this slightly from the top. You just have a lot of overlapping parts just happen as a result of that. This silhouette is mostly simple on the outside with complexity on the inside. And
Mhm.
I would always say that that's a little harder than something that's more of the interest is the silhouette on the outside. So it's just kind of a difficult image, and it doesn't have like a very interesting composition, which that isn't necessarily, that's not a negative against it. It's just an informative type image, right? So this is more of kind of just like, here is this thing, and so you can see all of it, and that's sort of what it's about, right? It isn't meant to be dramatic or moody or something. It's more like a, here's just what this thing looks like. And those types of images, it's a little bit harder because you're kind of taking away some of the tools you have as an artist, such as the composition just being really dynamic,
Mhm.
helps something look cool, even if it's boring. But then you have something that like, not that this is necessarily boring, but it's a little bit of a lower key type of image, and it becomes harder because it doesn't have drama built into the presentation. So then you have to make sure that what's there is really clear, because that's the purpose of the image, is clarity. It's to show what this thing looks like and to not be confusing. Because you can make cool looking images if they have confusing or missing information, right? A lot of dynamic compositions are they leave out a lot of information because they choose presentation over clarity, over showing you what something fully looks like. Um, but this is going for technical description, and then that technical description has confusion in it. So it becomes even more noticeable when that happens. Okay, we can move on to this because this wasn't even the main purpose of our meeting, but
I see.
I'm happy to talk about whatever, you want to look at, of course.
Oh yeah.
Okay, so we can talk about okay, so just start with drawing so we can start at the very beginning. Um, give these some names. Line. Okay. So I'll just go through the process that I use, and I think it works pretty well. And like, of course, I'll try and explain as much as I can, but obviously there's always stuff that just gets lost. It doesn't get covered.
Yeah.
So if there's anything that pops into your head while I'm working that I'm not talking about, just call attention to it.
Hmm.
But the first thing I like to do is just fill use a sharp edge tool. So the marquee tool specifically is great for that to outline it. And I'm sure, this is mostly stuff you've seen variations of. This isn't like revolutionary idea, but fill that in and have hard edges to start with because it's much easier to take a hard shape, a hard edge, and make it softer than to take a soft edge and make it harder. And hard edges have good read to them and have like a high confidence of shape. And that we know is like, I mean, I would say that that's fundamentally a strong visual thing to have. So I'd rather start being weakening some parts on purpose. Start with something that's kind of weaker visually, but and trying to bring it up to that stronger. So the other thing I'm doing, so I'm using is like a hard brush and filling in, and this is where it helps to be very discerning or just very picky about your drawings and like the shapes that are in the silhouette. And when you fill that in and when you're painting, you need to actually match that exactly. And a lot of times what happens is people kind of miss the nuances of the shapes they made when they drew it. So they're like, I like my drawing, but then when I paint it, it doesn't look as good. And part of it is it's not accurately translated. So every decision you make about drawing hopefully is, purposeful, and you want to make sure to capture that in the shapes of this, because even if you leave out little bits, again, it's those little things that add up that start to make it fall apart. It's like obviously you're not going to forget a major component. It's like I forgot to put the ear on, right? Like you're going to remember that, but you might not give attention to like some little shape that sticks off
I see.
that's very small, and it's like, oh, I'll come back to that. So making sure to be as accurate as possible
Hmm.
helps. And again, I'll often go back and use it's tedious, like it doesn't feel very painterly to use that tool, but it does help to use like a sharp tool that gives a truly sharp
Hmm.
edge. Okay, so then I want to constantly turn off the lines and just like evaluate what I've made, because what's happening is, we're not coloring in a drawing. Like that's not how I would recommend thinking about it. Like this is a critical moment where we're taking something that exists as one language of describing form with lines, and we're translating it into a totally different language, which is actually form based reacting to light. So it's like we need to make sure that it's holding up in that light version, the version that has form to it. So each step of that we can look at, and so we can look at the silhouette and say, is this still interesting or is this like falling flat? And that's how you can go back and then become better at drawing, because then you realize, oh, I'm not including enough silhouette shapes that break out and have variety to them,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it's like a combination of small shapes and large shapes and curved shapes and square corners and round corners, lines that are long, lines that curve gradually, lines that curve suddenly. All of those come together to create variety. So looking at like, is there like noise and rest along the silhouette? So it's like a medium shape, and then there's like a different longer shape, then a tiny noisy shape, and then like a unique shape with a sharp angle. All of those just abstractly, because it doesn't matter what this is. What matters is there's interest in how the silhouette is shaped. That can help you become better at drawing because you think about those things, because seeing them in this flat, like 2D stamp form helps you notice those. And this is like, it's taking the ideas of workflow and just putting them in the order that I think makes sense. I don't think it makes sense to start with this because you don't know you don't know what it is that you're making. You can't just make an interesting silhouette and make it into a good drawing. Maybe you can, but I think that's very difficult. I think it's much easier to draw it because you're thinking about how this construction of everything works and what the thing is, and then you go back and you just check it as, say, is the silhouette good? And then you can adjust your drawing to fix silhouette issues, because again, we want clarity. So when I look at this, when it's really tiny in the corner, does it still look interesting?
Let's see. Yeah.
Okay, so then I have this layer that I can lock and block in the shadows first. So the way I think it's easiest to work, and this is going to vary for different people, but you can work light to dark, you can work dark to light, you can work middle to light and then dark, or you can work middle to dark and then light, right? There's all these different combinations of what orders you put the values in. What I find works best for me is like middle, low to dark, and then light after that. Like two values, you can get a lot done. So I want to pick a light direction and make very decisive choices about how that affects these forms. And I want to create the biggest shadow shapes that I can that are cast from the forms themselves or from something that's outside of the what we can see, right? So we could say there's a shadow like that, right? If that was part of the idea. And it's okay to do that, right? Because if we want interest, the goal is to create interest and to create a mood that's appropriate for what we want. So whatever we can do to make that happen, it's totally reasonable. So it's okay to have shadows from outside areas if that is appropriate for what you're creating. So again, I'll try and say, okay, maybe this cast shadow and just keep the edges nice and sharp for now
Mm-hmm.
with this in shadow, and then we'll say, okay, so we'll have this shadow there, and check and see at each kind of stage of the block in, is this still readable? And if I just glance at it, how well can I identify the read of this compared to the drawing? And the goal is to get as quickly as possible something that is readable as a 3D painting.
Yeah.
Just
Mm-hmm.
walking in more. Make the hair just darker because that's a different shape. So I want to see the readability of that quickly. So again, looking down in this corner,
Let's see.
then we'll get underneath the eyes. So any plane changes that are important to describing the features, I want to capture those probably as quickly as possible.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll get just a little bit there in the mouth. Okay, and then we'll check again. So, looking at this, what is left that is confusing is always the question. So you say, okay, I will address the areas that are the in most need to be clarified as what's going on. Some of it's covered up by lines, so it's a little deceptive, but we'll make sure to try and get this as quickly as possible again to read clearly. So we'll include like this extremely dark mouth, and also we'll get the nostrils in there. So turn that off again. So even now, like I feel the shape is starting to, emerge from that, and it's very minimal amount of work has gone into it, but it's revealing the form where when you look at the this block in, it's easy to imagine what this shape is. It's like it's not unclear for the most part, even though it contains minimal information. And that's always the goal, is to as quickly as possible put in the key pieces of value block in that reveals the form in the quickest way that you can do it.
I see.
Just wrap these around a little bit more. But really, what I find is, really quite helpful is to just continually check without the lines. So after each pass, and this is a little bit loose, so it's not super. It's not following what's here very accurately, and it's also missing information. So like all of the information about like the eye folds around the eye, that needs to be there because it's not reading. So I want to reveal that again as quickly as possible. So anywhere that there's a fold, just putting a shadow there instead of it, but not a line. Like I want these to have uh, its form that creates that equivalent of a line. It's not actually a line, but I'm intentionally keeping this very simple, right? So
Mm.
really, this is just a two value painting, because as soon as you introduce more values, it becomes harder to balance those. So if you can't get it reading with just two values, I would just stop there and continue to work on it at this like super basic level until it reads correctly and clearly before moving on. And it's the same, same philosophy as sculpting, right? It's like in 3D, it's just best to keep things really simple, and you just keep sculpting with that simple low poly model until it looks good before you add more information. This is the painting version of that, right? Is you keep sculpting with a very low information, um,
Mm.
to maximize what you can do with that. And it's very tempting to try and move sooner, uh, but you shouldn't do it because maybe we're excited, or maybe we're trying to fix something and we're like, okay, the way to fix this is I need more. And eventually you do need more, but if it's not looking good with less, probably adding more is not going to correct that or cause that to get any better.
Mm. I see.
And then on this, like, so these form shadows, so shadows cast by parts of the what we can see, having these just simulate um, reflections of shapes that are in there. So for instance, we can say like, okay, there's a hair that sticks off, and I want that to be, we see the effect of that in the shadow,
Mm-hmm.
even if it's not totally accurate, that can be very compelling to making it feel more real because it's like, oh, well, that the reason there's a shadow shape like that is because there's something casting that. Like we need to have these sort of uh, relatable ideas of from light, and it just needs to be about right. It's just an approximation, and just generally being consistent with the light direction. It doesn't have to be exact. It just has to feel right, but it can be off a little bit.
I see.
And then this brush, so this is something that's worth of note. So this particular brush, you can see it makes a sharp edge in one side and a soft on the other, and the direction you move it makes those switch. And it's very helpful because sometimes on the inside of the shape, I want soft transitions, right? So we don't want to have maybe super hard edges here.
Right.
So it's a quick way to do both. So that way, when I paint down here, I can paint hard edge along here and a soft edge on the inside. Or if I do want a harder edge, I can do that easily. So at this point, when I look at this small, I feel like, okay, this pretty much includes the information that should be there. It's clear. I can understand the shapes. And that's the most important thing. And like, there's still like ambiguity around the eyes, for instance, because it's complicated shape with lots of value changes and plane changes. Um, but sticking to just like clarity and using just big sweeping brushstrokes, as quickly as possible. And part of what helps with that again is just the masking off, because then I don't have to worry about the outside, painting outside of the shape is just automatically done for me.
Mm,
Get
I see.
a little more plane change here. Okay, so at this point, what I would do is I take the lines and I'm just going to turn them to a color so there's no gray in the picture because we don't want any like non-color. So I'll just go over those with this like dark red and implement those into the painting itself. So I'll take these two, so the line layer and that fill layer, and just merge those into a new layer. And for now, like I'll keep that. So I still have those lines by themselves and that fill by itself, but now this is just its own, and lock that. So now when we paint again, we can paint inside that shape very easily. But now we have the values of the lines mixed in because that's helpful to have because it's there are a lot of lines where I want there to be value anyway.
I see.
So now I'm going to go darker and carve in some more shapes. And I think that's a good way to think about it, is like making cavities and making parts that, stick out, right? So it's not about, again, it's not about outlining anything. It's about just showing where light goes and where light doesn't go and just kind of pushing back and forth. So I want to give some definition to this like ambiguous shape. So the hair can be tricky because that can get very non-defined in like where the planes are. So I want to turn it into more geometric shapes and just make lighting that value changes that help define what those shapes are.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't get confusing, because again, clarity, right, is that I need this to not be confusing.
I'd be confused.
Very, very important. Like if there's one thing to take away from anything talked about today, it's like getting stuff to not be confusing is really important.
I see.
And again, I can't turn the lines off, right? Because now they're part of the painting, but I can look at the little picture. And that's really the most important thing is if something is clear, it should look pretty legible, even if it's very small. And that's, again, this is so important. Like this is never not here. Like I always have that active because it just helps you spot poor choices of like, oh, I made that too complicated, or I made those things too close together, or those values aren't different enough, so I can't tell that this is different from the thing it's next to. And again, just trying to be very reserved in when I'm introducing new tools into this. So sticking with mostly sharp edges along the edges of things and then soft just on the smoother curvature parts. But really now we're to three values, right? So now we have the middle value,
Mm-hmm.
we have a little bit darker value that's different enough that you can see the difference but not dramatic, because I don't want to make this like super stark.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have a dark value, so we're up to three, working from middle and then stepping down, and just again thinking of this as kind of carving shapes.
You see, dark, and the middle of the dark. Yeah.
Just think how much easier it will be to make something look good with kind of more if it looks good with less. So right, if it looks good in three values, it will look even better when you have four values or five distinct, value sections to it.
Mm-hmm.
And again, trying to keep the brush as big as I feel like I can and still operate at the do what needs to be done. So it's like just making big changes. So putting in big chunks of value, because being decisive is important. It shows when in your work. It's like you can tell when there are decisions that are intentional and then decisions that are kind of non-committal, and the ones that are intentional always feel better because it just results in, again, it comes back to the technical reason, which is it results in more clarity, and that always feels better. So that's a lot of this is oriented around trying to have that be the outcome. It's just like it's decisive and brings clarity with it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so value wise, so I think we'll just go to grayscale. It reads structurally, it's has a lot of room to go up in value, which is usually where I like to be. I like to get it looking pretty good with lots of space left, and there's even room to go down some. And then speaking about color, this is wrapping a lot of things. Mostly I'm focusing on value because that's, as you know, like the value does most of the work, and then color is it's a mood thing more than it's a structural thing. Um, the saturation is the part that can cause problems with readability, and this is kind of the middle saturation. So you can check it. It can be helpful to do is just open a color picker and then just sample
Mm-hmm.
and look at where that is on the saturation. I like to be this about the middle or down from there. Anything above that starts to is too saturated. So we'll just check and make sure is this are there any like oversaturated parts? And it's all kind of in this small range. And that's a good place to be because, like, as with values with saturation, I think it's good to kind of be sort of neutral and then go up and down from that middle point.
Mm-hmm.
Usually down. up in just key areas. Like we probably don't want too many highly saturated areas on a face, and that can throw off how something feels too.
Hmm.
But even though this is uh, color wise, this is monochromatic, right? All of this is the same color temperature. This structure, because it has structure due to the values, it feels okay, even though it's actually very low interest. Like the color, there's no color interest here at all.
I see.
So what I like to do is go take a soft light layer and add some temperature shifts. So really subtle, and then soft light is good for that. And there's this kind of just generic like color zone idea for faces, and this is like pretty much any skin tone too. This applies. This idea that you can have kind of warmer, redder around the nose and eyes, and then going cooler around the lower area. If that works well to just make things look interesting, and it gives you some variety
Hmm.
in the colors, and it can be very subtle. Like you don't want it to necessarily be hit that really hard, but one color temperature across anything, whether it's a face or anything else, tends to feel kind of flat and a little this underwhelming. So just building that in sooner rather than later. So keeping that in mind, I'll grab those groups. So now I'll go to kind of this like, reddish pink and just like subtly warm up.
Mm.
And that's a good starting point to work off of. And my values haven't changed much. Like this is mostly just influencing color temperature as opposed to changing any of the values or structure of anything. Go back up to the forehead. I'm just going to kind of bring that up a little bit in value, still soft light, and also just getting that temperature. It's like I'm warming it up there. Okay, and then so now if we just look at the values, so there's a little bit of a change, right? So it's like rounded out the form just a little bit,
Hmm.
but it's still very low. It's still like mostly mid key and then some low values to kind of define the form. So again, we still have a lot of space to move value wise. And this is, I keep saying that because a lot of what happens when people work that I see that causes them problems is they put in light values too early and they run out of space to go any lighter, and they haven't finished kind of adding all of the effects and forms. So what if you want like there to be a shiny spot? If this you make the character already be bright value, you can't make a bright value on top of that because you're already at the max and you can't get any brighter. So you want to kind of leave yourself room to move and make brighter effects. So this is a normal layer on top of this. I'm just gonna properties. So something that can be helpful. So we'll show us like so here's how now effective bringing in light values can be at this point, right?
Hmm.
So if we just using cool and lighter, I'm just those spots that can be a little bit oily on the skin. It's super effective because we've left space to do that. So now that contrast is extremely accentuated, even though this is very low contrast, right? If we look at this compared to this value, like in the background, right, it's still a ton of space, but it feels bright by comparison because we've put it next to darker values and we've left again more room to move upwards in value. And I'll use just turn like some of the subtle forms, so like the lip sticking out, like turning that upwards. So I don't want to maybe highly, you know, sharp edge that because I want it to be a subtle change, but we can just ease into that. And using in this case, not just it's a lighter value, but there's also a color that's cool. So this is saying that I'm taking environmental color. So we're saying the environment around this character is cool.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what can be reflected onto their skin. So it gives us one more color type, injected into the image. So it helps it feel more robust from a color profile. Look at the eyes. And including the shadow from the lid can really help. Like, eyes are just so important. So making sure that we include as much dimensional information to like really make them feel integrated into the skull. And then it's aggressive, turning this form up. Just grab like a lighter value that's also more toward the kind of the reddish, and turn the cheeks upwards. So getting like the top part of the cheek just to find a little bit more. And of course, just like thinking about, anatomically, like what's going on for like those shapes and just deciding how it's mostly just how sharp do you make the transitions between those different planes of the face. Just a little bit of high point. Just like turning the form of the lip a little bit more. So I want to make that a little bit stronger value change. And if we catch like the fat underneath the lips that sticks out, that can really help. Again, accentuating like any sort of 3D forms. It's just that if you miss them entirely is the problem. It's not that you need to overdo it, but if you don't include it at all, it really draws attention to this not having that information there. So including like if there are plane changes happening, having some amount of attention given to that dramatically helps it feel real or believable.
I see.
So we're not always trying to make something real. We just want it to be believable feeling.
Mm-hmm.
Again, if we look at this as grayscale, still fairly like middle to low value range. And if I just jump ahead and say you don't have to always include bright values, right? But it's nice to have that option. And for instance, we could make the eyes feel shiny because there's still room value wise to do that. And that might be the only spot pretty much that ever gets that bright. Just like lightening up, like rounding out that area just a little bit, and we can bring a little bit of this tone down here. So that's like that gets you most of the way to something that is going to work, right? So it's just like trying to get to that readable stage. And then at this point, right, it's like I either know that this is working or it's not. And the remaining parts of painting are fairly straightforward of just kind of refining what's here, but getting those major pieces in as quickly as
Mm-hmm.
possible. And I think like in terms of practicing, I think like painting something to this degree is about a good place to stop and then just start over. To get good at this beginning part is more helpful because beyond this is just like you're kind of gently tweaking things, but you aren't making any big decisions anymore. You want to make like big decisions quickly at the beginning and get confident about that and practice not putting off those decisions for where like maybe dramatic value changes go or like where your shadow shapes are, like those things you want to get in the habit of doing those as early as possible. And so I think sometimes when people work on longer form things, they get in the habit of kind of just putting that off and dealing with it later because it's hard because that's what makes or breaks your painting. So it's good to just force yourself to do that hard part of just blocking stuff in a definitive way. And then you'll become much faster and be able to make things that work well more quickly.
I see.
Looking at this, there's still like still tweak this a bit, but hopefully like do you feel like that made sense to how you think about things or applies to kind of the way that you would work on something? I don't know. It's more about the concepts of like what you're trying to do than the exact order you do it in or how you go about it. So there's lots of ways to achieve this set of things that you need to do.
Yeah, I think that's totally makes sense because like I was looking up other artists' digital painting work on our station, and I was like, I don't think none of this are really complex, like a lot of stroke in one image, but like, it's more like they are really conscious about like where and how much they put in every single step.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, being economical with your work is extremely important just because it helps you again achieve like a preview of the finished version sooner is that's what I would describe like the intention of what we're trying to achieve because it's easier to correct things again at a less complex state than it is to deal with that later when there's more stuff to push around. So that's what I definitely would encourage is just to get that.
Let's see.
That's that, and then it's like pull in one other kind of a different image, different style image. So this is just like kind of almost a similar level to that, right? It's like still kind of rough.
Mm-hmm.
But if we just like having these strong value changes between parts and like when you have things that come together, so like the nose coming into the face, for instance, just like enhancing that point that they meet is helpful to just emphasize the plane changes because things that feel muddy, right? Often it's because there's lack of description of the shapes. So anything that helps to like emphasize that and on faces usually a more nuanced way of doing that. So like having the values like slightly increase where they value differences increase a little bit where things come together can be really helpful for that.
Mm.
And then like this just has like a lot of cool in it, so it's just a very contrast of like warm and cool, and it helps it even though it's like it's a low key like value painting, right? Like it isn't like a huge like dramatic value change, but there's interest instead is more through like color change and temperature differences. So it's like there's warm and there's cool, and that's like those play off each
Mm-hmm.
other. And like the warm is kind of again kind of this band across the face where you just have like more blood vessels closer to the surface, right? So it just like makes sense that you can warm that up and it will feel natural to do
Mm.
that. And just like getting because you need interest where people look, right? So faces, people look at faces, so you need to like kind of give them a payoff. So it's like every tool that you can figure out to just like bring interest, whether that's cool shapes in your drawing, and then like flattering those shapes with appropriate rendering to like show that shape, and then also making it like a tasty to look at because it has nice color contrast, and everything is about contrast, right? It's like angles are contrast, color is about creating contrast because there's temperatures that are different, right? And then the values, obviously there's contrast in values, so we want to include every type of contrast there is to some degree. And let me look and see. I don't know if I can find it quickly here, but let me just look real
Oh yeah.
quick. I have this list that I make that I show people of contrast types to remember. So it's kind of helpful. Let's okay. I think just go through this real quick. Okay. I'm looking for there's a specific page I'm trying to look for here. I think it's on here. Maybe I'm totally wrong. Uh, okay, maybe I don't actually have this. Um, well, oh, I can describe it real
Oh yeah.
quick. Okay, so here's something that's helpful too. And this is just like for design in general, like it happens to use characters as examples, but just it can help you make stronger work by just remembering where it fits on like this scale of what you're even trying to accomplish. And it can help you kind of guide your choices as an artist of like what kind of group you're trying to fit into. So like this is super strong visually because it's super clear, right? Like the shapes are very strong type shapes and it's easy to look at this and quickly tell what you're looking at. So really memorable, and like a lot of very popular things are like this, right? Where they're just iconic basic shapes, and a lot of characters are really people connect to, but it's very
Hmm.
abstract. And then on the opposite, it's like this is highly relatable in the sense that it looks like real life mostly, but it's not as memorable because it takes longer for you to process what that character looks like, what those pieces are, because it's just complicated to look at. So that's the scale. And then there's stuff in between. And I only have two spots between that, right? So it's like one of them is um like pretty realistic textures. So the rendering is realistic, but they're still pretty stylized shapes. There's like very strong shapes. This is a tough one. Both of these are kind of can be tough to do. And then this is the opposite where it's like pretty realistic shapes where it doesn't exaggerate shapes very much, but then the texture is like kind of iconic, right? So it's like that's like very eye-catching and like graphically strong. And all of these work because they all have a highly like attractive element, right? So this works because it's highly like clear and has strong iconic, and it just like completely embraces that. This works because there's strong graphic element, plus it contains real life shapes, so it's relatable but also iconic because of the graphic shapes. This works because there are graphic shapes but then realistic feelings to the materials, and then this works because it's just closest to reality. And I think it can be helpful to sort of ask yourself what you're trying to accomplish when you design something, when you're kind of going for whatever a finished look is like where on this kind of chart would that fall, so you don't kind of mix ideas that maybe aren't very compatible and just say, okay, the point of what's strong about this will be, and then you say, I'm going to have, you know, fairly nuanced shapes, but I will have highly like identifiable texture to it. And you can go, look at art that you like, and you can probably like categorize it and say, okay, this would fall into this category, and this is why this works, and this falls into this category, and that's why it works. And I find that helpful to sort of define like my vision of what I'm even trying to do. Because if you just say, I just want to make stuff that looks good, that's fine, but that isn't very
Mm.
helpful because it's like, what do you do,
Yeah.
right? Because there's so many
Hmm.
options.
I see.
Yeah. I had this cool list, but I guess I didn't keep it. I don't know. Yeah. Well, I might have it somewhere else. I'll see if I can find it and bring it up
Oh
later.
yeah. Yeah, I think that explained really
But
well.
it's
Hmm. Yeah, go
good.
ahead.
Yeah. So yeah, I guess the one other thing I'll just make sure to be really clear about, and I'll just give like the quick off the cuff version of that because it is such an important
Yeah.
idea. Um, and this really helps because this is, again, it's one of those broad answers that's like a little bit hard to say, okay, how does this apply to what I did and how can I use this? But like everything that we're trying to do is to create contrast because that's what makes something interesting, right? So it's like boring, but then as soon as you do that, then you notice it because there's contrast, right? So there's change. So all the types of contrast there are, right? So there's size contrast, there is contour contrast.
Oh.
So like those would be two different types of contours, and those can be inside and out, right? Anywhere there's any kind of shape defined, you have that. There's I'll give a couple different versions of this. So frequency contrast. And that's like tricky because that can be all sorts of types of things. So that could be like materials on something could have high and low frequency, but that could also just be like the silhouette has frequency, right? So this is like, if we look at the silhouette, so it's like this is medium, and then this is like more detailed, And then if we go to like here, like this, if this were a little more defined, this would be like a high detail. So that's like a high frequency next to a low frequency next to a medium frequency. And having like a good rhythm of those things in a group is important. So you don't want to have, the same type over and over. You want to have like a variety, and even the proportions of like how much variety there is as you go around shapes. So it's like, okay, this is a novel shape that's low frequency next to a high frequency that's like a different feeling shape. So like curves next to like a pointy, right? Because all a line can do, right, is it either goes gently around a corner or it goes like 90-degree or something sharper. And it's just like a bunch of variations of that, right? So you go from this to this to this to this, right? And you just make that angle smaller and smaller. And that's all
Yeah.
it can do, right? Is it can be straight or it can be sharp or it can be
Mm-hmm.
curved. And just thinking about how your image is constructed shape wise from those different things, it's important for that type of contrast. And that's yeah, shape contrast. But so these ones are they're sneaky because there are so many types. Like usually we think of like value contrast when we say the word contrast, but there's so many different types that are also at play. And it's like to some degree, you need to be consciously balancing all of these together in an image. And they all have like they all come in at different times, right? So when you're drawing, we don't have value contrast that doesn't exist in a drawing, right? But we do have frequency contrast, we have contour, we have size, we have shape, right? So just being aware of looking out for repetitions of any of these things. If you can, and then we also have hue contrast and with color, right? We have hue and temperature contrast and saturation contrast. So all of these things, keeping all of those in balance and being aware of them, because as soon as you forget about any one of these things, it will affect your work because it's like, okay, if you have all these, I got this one and this one, but I forgot about this one. So then that will often stand out as like a weak point in your work. So this is pretty abstract, but this is like when it comes back to like what is appealing design, having the right balance of these types of contrasts is what makes something, I think, effective or not, and makes it feel like good quality artwork or not. And it's like artists that are know what they're doing are paying attention to all of these things. And it's not like you're consciously saying to yourself, oh, I need more like frequency contrast here, but you're just kind of looking at your image and you're making decisions based on the balance of the image. And it's like, okay, it needs more attraction visually at this spot. So I will put in a type of contrast, and then you choose the right types of contrast off of this list that work for whatever that application
Mm-hmm.
is. So if you just need to create frequency, you say maybe just having the material have higher frequency there is important, or you put like more little shapes there because you need more frequency. Like there are multiple ways to add that um, needed needed
Yeah.
changes. But anyway, so that's I'll look around and see if I can find because it's a list that has like it's like 20 things on
Oh,
it.
that's a
And
lot. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, there's a lot more.
Mm-hmm.
Like it sit down and just like write down and think of like all the types of contrast that can appear visually because they're all obviously going to be visual components. And I think it's pretty helpful to just kind of expand what you're even aware of could be going on. And then even if you just it improves just a couple of them, right? And the next thing you do, it will improve your work and help you kind of just make stuff that feels better, that just has a better feel to it.
Right.
But yeah, so do you think, is that enough for you to kind of go forward? Because we're at like 77 minutes here, so I don't want to go too
Oh, yeah.
long.
I think that's it was a lot of information today, and it's really definitely like helpful and it's like something new. Like there's a lot of things I never heard before. That makes sense. Yeah.
Good. Hopefully
It's really
useful things you've
useful.
never
Yeah, I'm
heard before.
excited to use all this
Good.
skill in the practice. Yeah.
Yeah, just don't don't overwhelm
Oh,
yourself and just like I would set simple goals and just like again, I would go for that like make a drawing that's nice, that has good shapes to it and good
Hmm.
proportions. And then when you paint it, just go for that like quick read. And I would really encourage, if you block it in and it's like not working, I would start over and try and do like maybe give yourself like blocks of like 10 minutes and see what you can do in 10 minutes to block in just like shadow shapes, and just do that if maybe two or three times, and it is worth it.
Yeah.
It's not like wasted work. It's like you're trying to just like get a hang of like what works quickly to
Hmm.
do, and it will immensely help to
I
do
see. I
that.
see. Yeah, I think it's really given me like a different perspective to like observing and like think of how people process it because I think as you saw my work, I'm really like a drawing person, and like, even though I keep like drawing
Hmm.
like trying to painting, and my mindset was, oh, if I work on it long enough and if it's complex enough, and maybe it'll get to the point I
Yeah.
want it, but I just like start
Yeah.
realizing it's not like the way I think it is. So yeah, and
Yeah.
yeah. So would you mind to share your brush that you used in the very beginning? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll send the whole
Oh,
set to
okay.
you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, you
Mm-hmm.
bet. Here, I'll show you just real
Okay.
quick what that brush set includes and just tell you what to pay
Oh
attention
yeah.
to. So make this bigger. So yeah, that's it. So that's the whole thing. So just these first groups, so they're separated by words. I don't know if you can see, that's probably really tiny, but there's like, it says core there, and then it says down here there's one that says loose, and that's just like that first section between those words. 90% of the time I'm just using these brushes that are in that first group. So that's maybe like 15 brushes in
Mm-hmm.
there. And out of those, there's ones that I mostly use. So like I like this one for drawing because of the line weight changes. It just feels good.
Yeah.
And then for painting stuff in, for almost all painting, I use this blocky brush. That's why it's up at the top. And then this one that's kind of like these like 3 points on it. I like the way that this one
Mm.
makes shapes. And then here's that one that has the two sides to it.
I see.
And just with those, you can, I mean, you can make awesome painting. I would just stick to like a few simple things. So like with those like two or three brushes, you can
Mm-hmm.
do anything. And then sometimes it is helpful to use a soft brush, but very I would, if I had to not use a type of brush, I would always not use a soft brush and just use harder brushes because you get more distinct shapes. Because you can just get into a lot of overly soft, like kind of uncommittal shapes by using soft brushes. So it's kind of, if in doubt, I would steer away from that and stick with more decisive brushes because it just gives
Mm.
stronger marks
Oh
that way.
yeah.
Yeah, and then everything else, I mean, you can obviously mess around with that, but these are all kind of like special case like stuff. Like again, these top just few are
Mm-hmm.
really the majority of what I work with.
I see. Yeah.
Yeah. So any other questions before
Uh,
we kind of finish up
I think
here?
first, so like homework is gonna be like a one face portrait and just try to like make it as good as I can, and we're gonna talk about it next week. Um, yeah, and I think we can like go through like character design in the next meeting. So
Yeah.
I think that's pretty much
Yeah,
it.
that's a big
Hmm.
subject, but we can
Oh yeah, I'm
definitely.
excited for it. Okay. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, sounds good.